Well, howdy ho, everybody. Welcome to Hashtag Sports, where, as Mario say, always trending. He made up a bunch of taglines. I'm not going to pretend to remember them. So I'm Paul. That is Ryan Lasel, joined on my immediate, what would that be to everybody? The right. And
Stage
tonight,
right, stage left.
yeah, I was a theater guy, not afraid to hide that. Jazz hands. But we're going to talk state of the Bills. I think now that the dust has settled a little bit, probably time to kind of recap where we are, where things are going, where things have been, and obviously pull some things from the chat and let's have a great discussion about the Bills. But first, if you're watching this video, make sure you leave a like, a comment. Any engagement is great engagement. We really try to respond to almost every single comment. So anything you have to say, make sure you let us know. So Ryan, Buffalo Bills leave the draft after trading down, which was sort of the running joke of covering night one of the draft, right? Like we all knew it was coming. It felt like it was an obvious thing. I don't think I had traded with Kansas City on my bingo board, but it is what it is. And Buffalo sneaks down to pick 33 to grab Keon Coleman, the wide receiver from Florida State, formerly of Michigan, right? So he made a point when he was at his press conference when people were talking about, oh, you got a jacket. Is that because it's Buffalo? He's like, no, I played 2 years in Michigan, man.
Michigan
get
State, actually. He was a
Michigan
basketball recruit for Tom Izzo. So, yeah, pointed out that and, made sure to quickly endear himself with not only the Bills fans, but also the NFL community as a whole as maybe the most likable member of this 2024 NFL draft class.
Yeah.
And I've been talking to friends and family who've reached out about the draft and like, man, I like that Coleman kid. I'm like, I really hope he's good because he's so likable and he's going to be so fun to have around for the next 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
I hope he's not another Sammy Watkins because the fans will turn on him quick, and I think it'll be a tough turn on a kid like that.
Well, and I think the dynamic is very much setting up like that, right? When you look at when Sammy Watkins came in, what else was here? Like it had been a desert at the wide receiver position for some time, and you're back to that, right? Right now, you're running with a wide receiver group that is a fascinating one if you really love the 2020 NFL draft, right? You had KJ Hamler, who was selected before Chase Claypool, who is also in Buffalo now. So that 2020 draft is sort of sneaking in a little bit for some players that Buffalo probably had on the board at the time, right? Like that was a draft that, again, you had Justin Jefferson come out of that draft, Michael Pittman come out of that draft, T. Higgins come out of that draft. Like you had some very good players there, and definitely a position the Bills would have scouted because they obviously, they ended up trading out with the pick that was used for Jefferson. They obviously loved Stefan Diggs to make that deal. But again, I think it's a different dynamic. That was the draft that they really didn't get to address the wide receiver position in their mind.
Right. Yeah. 2020 was, like you said, they've now got 3 guys from that class on their roster, even though Cephas wasn't drafted. He was also from that 2020 class.
Yeah,
so
that's what I mean.
Really, really interesting to see what they're trying to do. And it's those guys that are these reclamation projects that Beane and McDermott have loved. They haven't quite found their guy yet at wide receiver. I mean, you could argue maybe John Brown was that reclamation project. I mean, he was trying to cling to, what made him a good to pretty good wide receiver in the NFL. But you've got guys on this roster now that have stuff to prove, right? You've got Cephas, who's trying to fight back from being missing an entire year for gambling. He also had, that not guilty verdict in college that allowed him to go back to play college football, get a chance at the NFL. Claypool, who, asked out of Pittsburgh, arguably a good situation in Pittsburgh. Now he's on his 3rd team in 2 seasons.
Yep.
And KJ Hamler, who's, a guy who's been trying to find his spot in this NFL. So it's going to be really interesting. I think they've done a lot at wide receiver. We're going to talk, about if they've done enough, but they've done a lot at wide receiver over the last few weeks to show that it's a priority for them to address this offseason.
Well, and it's pretty easy to flame Chase Claypool for the way that he acted, right? But really go back and think of every player that's come out of Pittsburgh. Why would you take any of their receivers, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I know Juju Smith-Schuster won a Super Bowl with the Chiefs, right? But like Deontay Johnson got traded to the Panthers. Lord knows that's not going to work. Let's see what other famous receiver. Juju Smith-Schuster was one of the worst contracts the Patriots signed that entire season. Actually, within the NFL, that was one of the worst contracts in the NFL when Juju went to the Patriots. What were some other ones?
Antonio Brown.
Antonio Brown. Yeah, that's a good one. Right.
Remember how that ended?
Yeah, that's a good one. So it's not like, and then you have Claypool, right? Who's traded for a first round pick. Like the Steelers traded Chase Claypool for Joey Porter Jr. effectively. So good on Pittsburgh, right? But the Steelers don't have the greatest reputation for, for these guys leaving and doing anything of note afterwards. So again, Claypool was a bit of a problem when he was in Pittsburgh. Attitude problem, maturity problem. Goes to Chicago, just straight stops blocking in the run game, like no interest. I think he only had less than 40 targets in 2 years there. Like it was abysmal. And then he goes to Miami for pennies on the dollar, and he got 7 targets his entire time in Miami. Like it was a joke. So he's here to reclaim value because this was a guy who he was playing with Big Ben and things looked great. And then they didn't. So they
tried to turn him into a tight end in Miami too. Don't forget about that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, he's got the size, right? And that's it. If they couldn't get anything out of Gesicki, they weren't going to get anything out of Claypool at that tight end position, right? Like, let's just be honest about it. But so is Claypool enough of a distraction from the wide receiver room to give people hope?
Is he like the shiny object that just happens to be in his 5th season on this?
He's only team? 25, man. Like that's the thing. He's 25
young.
years old.
He's young.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of nice to haves if they pan out in this wide receiver room, right? Kudos, by the way, to Lay Mistress in the chat for that hilarious comment of Curtis
flamed
Samuel.
You a little bit. Yeah, flamed you a little bit.
I will say it's a high bar for if the ice cream truck is going down the road. I am deceptively speedy in those situations, but we were talking, Paul, in a group chat I think yesterday or the day before about kind of like what they have on this roster, and I think they've got a good mix of what you want out of a wide receiver group, right? You've got kind of those Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel guys, which are going to do like a lot of things really well. Keon Coleman. Chase Claypool, which are kind of those go-get-it type of receivers. You've got the Mac Hollins, Justin Shorters, which are just the tall guys that are going to go, be in those red zone targets. And then you've got a guy in KJ Hamler, who I think might be a sleeper to win that
Hamler
wide receiver
on this team,
4.
man. I love him.
He takes the top off of defenses. I mean, he ran a 4.27 in college. 4.36 was kind of like the unofficial time that he was clocked in heading into the draft. But I mean, he's one of those guys that I think Bills fans are really going to fall in love with pretty quickly, assuming he can kind of capture what made him great in Denver for the flashes that he had in Denver before he got hurt with the injuries.
And I mean, let's just that quarterback position was not.
Oh, it was
it was abysmal there, right? Like that was still the Drew Lock experiment. Like it was a bad situation. Who was the receiver for them? Patrick, right? Like a guy should
Patrick.
Just just an average NFL wide receiver, probably below average NFL receiver, right?
Yeah.
Below average separation, right? But he was the number one, like statistically, for longer than he should have been, right?
Absolutely.
And a player like Hamler just falls by the wayside. And it's a shame because I think that you're right. There's a lot of boom in that kid. And I think that's sort of what Buffalo has been going for is, listen, let's just keep taking lottery tickets, right? People are loving the idea of Justin Shorter, and that's a player you'll never get on your practice squad. So I guess that's sort of, let's walk through what the Bills wide receiver room actually looks like and then see how flexible are they really going to be? Because the idea is if you have to waive somebody on a rookie deal to get them to the practice squad, who can you do that with and who can't you? Because remember, you can also sign veteran wide receivers to your practice squad, right? But they, again, have to clear. It's still the same waiver policy, right? But, what are the options for the Bills at wide receiver? Because a player like Justin Shorter, either he's on this team or somebody's going to pick him up off waivers. He will not make it through waivers. It's not going to happen.
Yeah,
So,
unless something happens where he can get through on IR again, they can
mhm.
set up an IR situation like they've done the last
Yeah, but they
couple of
did that
seasons.
last year, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what happened last year. They looked at it and said, you know what? Let's just buy ourselves a year. I don't think you can do that again. Like, doesn't
No, I
that
would agree with
totally
that.
demoralize that player?
Yeah, I mean, and we again we talk about these things offline, but it's kind of that Mac Hollins, Justin Shorter, Chase Claypool. I think of those three guys, I think you're going to see one make the roster, and I think
Mhm.
they're going to try and put one of them on the practice squad. I doubt that Mac Hollins is going to be the practice squad guy, but Chase Claypool is only a year older than Justin Shorter.
Yeah, isn't that
So
crazy?
when you think about it that way, it's kind of like they're both 6'4", 225, like same type of frame. I really think that they want Justin Shorter to be that wide receiver 5 this
Mhm.
season. I think that they're hoping for that.
Yeah,
They bring in Hollins as kind of that contingency, that veteran guy, same size, plays special teams, does everything you want Shorter to do, but he's a veteran. He's 30 years old.
mhm.
He's been productive in the NFL. So if Shorter doesn't work out, we've got Hollins. And then Claypool becomes available. And it's like, well, we missed out on OBJ. He chose to go to Kansas City instead of Buffalo. So let's
Mhm.
bring in Claypool, and maybe he's option 1B behind Shorter. Maybe they're like,
Right.
well, if Shorter can't make the roster, he gets hurt, we have to waive him, whatever.
Mhm.
Then it's Claypool and Hollins. And if Claypool can capture what he had in Pittsburgh before he left, he's our guy. We're going to keep him. Hollins is on a low enough deal where, like you
Yeah.
said, I think they save like 1.1 against the cap or something if they
Yeah,
cut
it's like
him only
1.5. Yeah,
1.6.
it's about
Yeah.
1.5. His deal's worth right around 3 mil. It's a little short of 3 mil, but
Yeah.
about
So
half of it's
that
guaranteed.
deal doesn't preclude them from making a move on
No.
him
Yeah,
if
sure
they
does.
want to. But
Right.
by no means is it that type of contract where it's like, well, he's going to make this roster because they
Mhm.
gave him all this money. So,
Right.
there's a good breakdown there. And then I think Hamler and Isabella might be fighting for that, top off type of role.
Mhm.
Isabella may have the inside track because he was on this team last year, but I think KJ Hamler is arguably the more explosive of the two players. I think he's better in the return game. I think he's more explosive in an offense. He's going to bring that dynamic that they don't have on this roster, and they didn't
Right.
have all last season on
Mhm.
this
Yeah,
roster.
absolutely. So how many do you think the Bills are gonna end up trying to keep? I know it's a tough game to play,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I think it's interesting because we don't really know yet how they're going to
No.
format this team because of the new kickoff rules, right? The new
Right.
kickoff rules
Yeah,
really change a lot in terms of roster
absolutely.
dynamics.
Yeah.
This is the first year where I think you can legitimately look at this team and say, does Reggie Gilliam have a spot on this roster, right? Because
Mhm.
of the kickoff changes, his role is not as useful as it once
Right.
was. So
Yep.
do they opt to carry 3 tight ends, 6 wide receivers
I
versus
think
in the
that's
past where
probably
they've
more.
done 3, 5, and then
The
Reggie
one.
Gilliam has been kind of
Yes,
that
that one.
do-all kind of guy,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to see them carry 6
Mhm.
because I think that gives you the most flexibility, and it also allows you to be a little bit more specialized with your defense, which I think has a little bigger of a depth concern at the secondary spot, which is kind of where you see those wide receivers and secondary members kind of fight for those special teams reps. I think wide
Right.
receivers may win out in that instance.
So what's so interesting about that, right, is if the Bills do keep 6, which the chat is saying they want to keep 6, I totally agree. Don't forget, leave a comment, or if you're in the live stream right now, make sure you tell us who your 6 are for the Bills wide receiver room. I'm kind of with you, right? To me, KJ Hamler is the guy that I want to make the roster out of everybody, right? Curtis Samuel's a lock. Shakir's obviously a lock. Shorter, you're not going to be able to do anything else with. He almost has to make the roster because you're just going to lose him if not, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think
Yeah.
Brian Thompson sneaks to your practice squad if you
Yep.
want him. Andy Isabella sneaks to your practice squad if you want him. Tyrell
Shaver's probably
Favors,
one more year if
yeah,
they
that's what I
want
mean.
him.
Sneaks to the practice squad if that's what you're thinking, right? So to me, Shorter, Shakir, and Samuel are locks. I would like Hamler to make the team. Again, I think from those other players, probably the dynamic fits, right? So that's 4.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's just a sissy slap fight between the remaining 6'4" guys between Claypool and
Yeah.
Mac Hollins to me, right? And that's 5. I don't think they keep that. I don't know if they keep that many guys who are 6'4", right? Like it's been a dynamic that they've missed before. But if you keep Hollins and Claypool and Shorter, that's 3 guys that are 6'4". And at some point, aren't you like isn't NFL also about the dynamics that you could put within your offense, right? I know each of these guys is different, but like Mac Hollins is 30. Like, man, I'd rather bet on Claypool than Hollins if I'm Buffalo and I'm filling out the bottom two of the wide receiver room.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like you're not rostering 3 Randy Mosses, right? You're not
Yeah,
rostering 3 6'4" guys that can do everything. So you've
right.
got to find a way to balance that dynamic. And we've seen in this NFL that separation is so much more important than the ability to just be big.
Right.
I think you drafted Coleman because he has that ability to be big at an elite level.
Mm-hmm.
Claypool is big, but he's never really done it at an elite level.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing with Mac Hollins. I mean, Mac Hollins is a 30-year-old journeyman who has one season where he's got more than 40 catches, and
Right.
there's a reason for that. So I think you probably carry Coleman and then one of Claypool, Hollins, or shorter. Otherwise,
Right.
you get into, as we pick on Drew Gear from Rock Power Report 4, it's hat on a hat type of concept.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want too many guys that do the same thing on your
Mm-hmm.
roster because that pigeonholes you into what you can do. So
Right. Yeah.
I would fully expect it to be Shakir, obviously Samuel, obviously those two are locks. You're probably going to get Coleman as a lock.
Yeah.
Then you're going to get one of Claypool, Shorter, and Holland. So that's put 4. 5 is probably KJ Hamler or Andy Isabella. I think they would lean towards Hamler. Isabella maybe goes to the practice squad for one more season just to keep him around, elevate him on game days, things like that. And that leaves that last spot to either Isabella or probably Cephas, I would say, is maybe the inside track for that position, just because he was fairly highly touted coming out of college. He's been productive in the NFL, something that Andy Isabella hasn't been in the NFL thus far. And Cephas is really more of a possession type of guy. And I think that would free them up to bring him in on 5 wide sets and maybe just give a little bit of a different look in the slot opposite whomever's going to be in the slot, whether it's Kincaid, Shakir, any of those guys. He's just another body to throw in there should they go down for injury or they need 5 wides.
Do you think Claypool would do the same thing that Fournette did and say, listen, get me the hell off this practice squad, just release me, like get me out of here?
Yeah, I mean, I think Fournette had a little bit more like sway in that end because Buffalo wasn't the only team that wanted Fournette, right? Fournette wanted to go to a team where he thought he could win another ring, be productive, and
be on the field.
Yeah, and as soon as he realized that they weren't going to give him time, he's like, "What am I doing in Buffalo? Like I've played my entire career in warm weather stadiums. I'm not going to continue to be in Buffalo if I'm not going to be on the field." Claypool, he may look at things and just be like, 5 teams in 4 seasons is not a good situation to be in whatsoever. So I'm just going to be the good teammate and stick around here in Buffalo, see if maybe I can, create some buzz going into next season. But at the same time, he's asked out of one team already, so maybe he does it again if he's not getting on the field. But I would be surprised to hear that there was a bidding war for Chase Claypool. So he may be realizing that there's kind of like last stop before he's got to find a real job here, and he may not be willing to do that. So we'll see. It'll be interesting because he's done it in the past. But then you hope guys learn from situations like that in the past as well.
Right. Well, and I think Claypool kind of thought that he was more coveted than his performance tells you he should feel. Right. Like the truth of the matter is, you remove his senior season and he's an undraftable player. Like his senior season at Notre Dame was the reason that he went where he did. If he has even another pedestrian season, he's undrafted. So we're talking about a player who's clung on to 3 seasons out of his career and everything else has been forgettable. Like the definition of you might have forgotten he was on your team.
Right.
And, I think we're spending a lot of time, talking about Chase Claypool. I think, he's got a lot of boom. The question is it for Buffalo, right? I think Buffalo could slide him to the practice squad. I think he probably does clear waivers because he was a free agent this long for a reason, and he probably signed a league minimum deal. We don't have contract details yet. Over the Cap doesn't have them. They haven't been released through NFL transaction yet, but it's probably league minimum. And if not,
It'll
league
come out.
minimum
It'll come
very
out this
close.
week. Yeah,
Yeah.
because he signed on like Friday or early Saturday, so it'll come out this week when the league opens for business tomorrow probably. So,
Yeah.
but I would be surprised if it's a 1-year deal. We know it's a 1-year deal.
Right.
It'll just be a matter of, are there void years attached to it? Are there incentives attached to it? Is it just for the league minimum and then some incentives that get them up, up over $2 million or something along those lines? So, oh, and Paul, I do want to point out too, as Spin points out in the chat, I had every intention of bringing this up. Let's pour one out for Duke Johnson.
Oh, you love Duke Johnson.
My guy Duke. I mean, he was my fantasy darling for a few seasons. So definitely going to pour one out for Duke Johnson. Former retired as a Bill. So
whatever, man. Whatever floats your boat. So I think that's a good segue to mention that we're going to have a lot more content from hashtag this year, both on betting and in fantasy. It's something we all do, but we never really talk about it. I think we're all in the same leagues together. So I think there's like a competitive advantage to not talking about our fantasy football hot takes. But I'm really excited to get to that this year because there's a lot of times where you need that extra opinion. You're looking at a sit start and you really don't know. You're in a dynasty league, you play dynasty leagues totally different than, your keeper leagues versus we do a snake draft every year. There's no keepers. The way that you go about all those transactions changes by league. So I think it's really exciting to kind of have that opportunity to talk about that stuff because a player like Duke Johnson in a yearly draft league, no value. But in a dynasty league, in a keeper league, Duke Johnson carries some mild value for you because he's a guy that, listen, I'm looking at the matchup and I know Cleveland's going to be behind by 48 points at halftime. Duke Johnson's going to be the guy.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm excited to get to that. With that, I think let's just quickly talk about this. I have a feeling we'll probably release this on an episode later this week, Ryan, but let's talk about real quick the Buffalo Bills draft. So the Bills walked away with 10 picks, which is more than I thought they were going to. I really thought they'd walk away with 7. I figured they'd bundle a bunch of those 5th round picks, move up into the 3rd. That's not the way that played out. Do you think the Bills drafted players to cut them at this point? Like, does it feel like the roster is that deep, or are we just finally seeing a change where Buffalo is going to roster the players that they draft? Because the Bills have lost a lot of very good players to waivers when it came to having to establish your 53-man roster, because some guys that you're trying to get on the practice squad, they ain't going to get there. And the word's been out on Buffalo, their players get picked up on waivers. You lost Jack Anderson, you lost Nick, McLeod, you lost Alex Austin. Like these are guys that could have helped you at positions that you needed, but now they're gone. Did Buffalo draft a bunch of players to watch the league comb through the waiver fodder at roster time and find themselves some nice pieces?
No, I don't think so. I think what this draft signaled is this season is heading towards a transition year for the Buffalo Bills. They shed a lot of salary. They set themselves up for a situation where they're going to gain about, I think it's $9 million with the Trey White acquisition, or the move there. I thought that money was going to be used like on June 1st to re-up Teron Johnson, but they already did that, right? So that money's for something else. Now, is it to carry over? Is it to add a veteran in camp? Things along those lines. I'm not sure. But they drafted a lot of guys at need positions and a lot of guys at positions that we're going to need next season, right? Like they drafted in the 5th round. They went out and got a center from Georgia, right? That signals that they may be positioned to, if McGovern doesn't work out, like we're going to find somebody else to play center. So we're going to set ourselves up for that option now. They drafted a defensive end, a really productive defensive end out of Troy, who by all accounts is built out of a similar mold to Von Miller, right? Short arms, quick around the edge, kind of reinvented himself. So Von, is this his last season after that pay cut that he took? They drafted a corner. They drafted, the tackle through the pathway program, which I think is a heady play because it makes it easier to get him to the practice squad, right? And then
he's exempt from the practice squad.
Right. So there's you can just keep him on your roster. There's no way for anybody to necessarily steal him from you. So I think that was
he has never played football though. He's never played football.
Yeah. I mean, you do that because you're looking for depth, whatever, whatever you're trying to do. But I think ultimately what Bills fans need to prepare themselves for is as much as you can with a quarterback like Josh Allen, potentially prepare for a transition year, right?
Yeah.
Shakir's going to have to learn how to be a number 2 or a number 1. Keon Coleman's going to learn how to be a number 1 or a number 2. You're going to have to figure out what this offense looks like with Brady at the helm. You're going to have to figure out, do you have the right pieces on the offensive line? You're going to have to figure out defensively, what does this defense look like with 3 linebackers on the field instead of 3 safeties on the field, right? Like there's a lot of different things that you're going to see this year that I think they want to take 1 year. They accumulated picks for next year. Don't forget that as well. It's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, big time.
Because are they setting up a big deal in the offseason where they're going to trade some of these guys for, I don't know, T. Higgins sticks around for 1 more year. Cincinnati decides to tag him again, and next year is the year that they actually decide to move him.
Yeah.
Like, is that a move that potentially comes? Brandon Ayuk, does he become a free agent? Do they tag him next year and they can make the trade then? I think they're setting up a situation where they're expecting this to be a go win the division, see if you can make some noise in the playoffs, but you're not necessarily looking to be a 13-3 team that's going to be a 1 seed and make it all the way to the Super Bowl. I think they're setting this up as a transition year as best they can. Next year, they've got a bunch of draft picks and see what they can set up and kind of set the table for what next season looks like.
Well, and I think I think you brought up a great point on the kid from Troy. So that was Javon Solomon. And again, you get to these later round picks, and I think sometimes nobody has a crystal ball, right? One of the reasons we don't do a 7th round mock draft is because we'd be being foolish to say that we understand the value of players in the 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds. Like comparatively, you can look at, okay, of these 3 players that are still available, comparatively, who is somebody the Bills could target. The reality is doing coverage of those later rounds is just not, it's not knowledgeable coverage, right? People that tell you they know everything about stuff at that late in the draft, unless you work for an NFL franchise, you're just making it up, right? Like I'll just say that very, very confidently. But like Javon Solomon, if people are unaware, he led FBS with 16 sacks. He tied for 6th with 18 tackles for a loss. This was a guy that was in the backfield all the time. Also had tied for the team lead with 3 forced fumbles. Started all 14 games. Like, again, you're drafting in the 5th round a guy that might contribute for you at a premier position. Yeah.
And stayed and didn't play at Troy his entire career because he couldn't go anywhere else. Stayed at Troy because he liked the coaching staff, he liked the players. He decided not to leave, had offers to go other places. So there's there's something to be said. Sometimes these guys do slip through the cracks, right? Like there's a reason that Khalil Mack went to Buffalo and didn't go other places. And sometimes, I'm not saying Javon Solomon's going to be Khalil Mack, but there's a reason that talented players sometimes come out of small schools, right? Like Ed Oliver came out of Houston. Players don't come out of Houston very often, but he went there for a reason. So these guys all have their own whys in life, and it's important to remember, don't look at the school, right? Look at the productivity. 16 sacks doesn't happen on accident. I don't care what level of college football you're playing at. And in the FBS, all the more reasons. It's not like it's 16 sacks in D3, right? So, he's definitely someone that they think can play. And I think a lot of people thought could play. I mean, he was very much mocked in that 4th, 5th round range on a consistent basis. When on the aggregate, when we put together the hashtag big board, I mean, he was right there in round 4 or 5.
And let's be honest, right? Players like Khalil Mack out of Buffalo don't go top 5 ever, right? Like a player from Troy is not going to go top 5. He could have 100 sacks, right? Like exactly. It's that at some point the competition is looked at to be a detriment to the player's value in the draft. But again, these players are available. They're out there. and Buffalo's got to pick on him. So now they have a 4-year contract. The question is, now, mind you, it's a premier position that Buffalo is ultimately thin at after this year. So I think the odds that Solomon probably makes the team probably pretty good. You don't want to lose a 5th-round pick. But, there's some players here that you're probably going to lose. Travis Clayton. Again, he's your international player, right? Like the International Player Pathway Program.
I do like Spin's. I do like Spin's recommendation though. These new kickoff rules, man, they add a lot of interesting concepts. Like he played rugby, right? Mm-hmm. Like, can he catch the ball and just run forward? I mean, that's a rugby play, right?
That's a terrifying thought.
Situation. Yeah, I mean, that's a new situation. Who's exactly 6'7", 300 pounds. Like they were talking about Justin Fields maybe returning kicks because of this new kickoff rule.
Yeah.
In Pittsburgh, right? Yeah. So why not a experienced rugby player who's played at international levels and at a very high clip and productivity? Hey, well, I think Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott have shown a propensity, especially on the special team side of things, to try anything. So it wouldn't surprise me to see them try something with Clayton where if we can get him to catch kicks, those new kickoff rules makes it really interesting to have a 6'7", 300-pound rugby player returning kickoffs.
Well, let's not forget Keon Coleman started his college career as a returner. So that's a fun idea, isn't it? So I think career long was 72 for him in college. But listen, you put the ball in your best playmaker's hands. The idea of having kick return specialists, I think, is over. Right. Mm-hmm. You're not going to see Devin Hester again. You're not going to see, Hall? Who was
Dante Hall?
Dante Hall.
Human joystick.
Yeah. You're not going to see that because the rules are slanted against that. Now those players still have a role. That's a player like Tyreek Hill fit within that mold, right? Of a guy who's just super shifty, speed for days, great vision. Those guys have offensive positions now. They don't get relegated just to special teams. That's why a player like Nyheim Hines, it didn't work out, in Buffalo, and that's okay. Now that the rules have shifted, I'm happy to move on from that. I think there's probably more to talk about here, right? So why don't we shelf this and we'll push this to an episode that we'll release later this week. Everybody in the live chat, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And of course, leave a like, a comment, let us know what you think. For Mario, who's sunbathing at 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And Ryan, we appreciate your time. Have a good night. Go Bills.
Hello, fellow Bills fans. Sean Rogers, realtor and lead of the Mr. Rogers Homes team. Did you know that real estate is one of the best ways to build wealth, and right now is one of the best times to own an investment property in Arizona? Please reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions so we can take the next step to your financial freedom here in the Valley of the Sun, utilizing real estate. As always, God bless America and go Buffalo!